Thank you very much. The title of my remarks today is called Teach the Children Well, Best Thinking About Migrants and Refugees. My role, I am also a philosopher, and my topic today, Bill Vendley just did a wonderful job earlier of talking about the consensus or the overlapping consensus across different religious traditions as he sees it about some of the moral principles, the virtues and so on that are required in addressing these complicated problems. It would be good if in addition to interreligious consensus, there was also agreement from the secular ethical academy. And so that's what I want to talk about. Is there consensus from those of us who work, as it were, from the point of view of something like a secular ethics about the kinds of norms, values, and habits of heart and mind that should guide us in thinking about migrants and refugees, the problem and the solutions. And as I said, my focus is on moral education. I keep coming back to this issue, partly because I think that it will not be people of our age group that solve these perennial problems. It will be younger people. And we need to equip them with the kind of cognitive, emotional, and moral tools that will equip them to do good thinking about the problems that will face us. So the child is, as we know, the father of the man. The problems that we're facing about migrants and refugees are perennial. And another assumption I'm just going to make is that we can't assume virtue, either intellectual or moral virtue, in the actors involved in this problem. And so I'll talk both about cognitive and ethical virtues here. Why do I say that? Well, I just think the sort of consensus over world historical time, Aristotle, Confucius, the Buddha, many of the great wisdom traditions, people who try to answer the question, what is human nature like deep down inside beneath the clothes of culture, come again and again to the idea that we're a mixed bag. There's a certain amount of fellow feeling, clearly, in humans that can be awakened, bodhicitta among Buddhists, Buddha nature, compassion among Confucians, but there's also a fair amount of self-serving ego, the poisons in Buddhism, or just basic egocentric attitudes about persons. So the topic, the session that I'm talking in right now is called, is about framing. So I think one way to think about framing the problem of migrants and refugees is to think about sort of our cognitive equipment. What kind of biases are humans prone to in thinking about these kind of problems? And I'm kind of relating this to things that were said over the last couple days. So one problem that we know about from, for example, child developmental psychology. So for example, I recommend Paul Bloom's recent book called Just Babies. The subtitle of it is called The Origins of Good and Evil. And it's a wonderful compendium of the best thinking about how children develop their moral sense. It's reminiscent of Aristotle. You need to raise children to have good values. They just don't come into the world having good values. But what he also shows very clearly is that children, by the time they're 10 to 16 months old, have strong preferences for their home language, the faces of their caretakers, and the kinds of faces of their caretakers. So, and it's very, very easy to produce what we would call racism and xenophobia just by using puppet games with children, by good puppets and bad puppets, puppets that look familiar and puppets that don't look familiar. This is not that surprising if one takes a sort of naturalistic anthropological view of the history of humankind. We know that for the first 240,000 years of our existence, we lived as small group hunter-gatherers. It's only in the last 10 to 12,000 years with the domestication of animals and agriculture that we started to build large communities. It's not obvious that we were initially developed all the cognitive equipment to live in the kind of diverse communities that we now live in. Now that just puts a constraint on the kind of creatures we are. We have these sort of biases towards tribalism, in-group, out-group divisions, and so on. Another set of biases that are very familiar from the social psychological literature, what are called self-serving biases. They're sometimes called positive illusions. So as I look around this room, it's a little bit hard to tell you this, but most of you, if you were asked, will rate yourself in the top 5 to 10 percentile in terms of looks. You'll also relate, that's why we're here, exactly. You'll also rate yourself in the top 5 to 10 percentile in intelligence and virtue. You'll also are very likely to think that you deserve to be as handsome, virtuous, well-off as you in fact are. This is very, very common findings that are found again and again and again, and these generalize. Actually, Americans are a little bit more prone to the self-serving bias than people of other cultures. But the point here is there are cognitive mistakes involved in the self-serving bias. I mean, we know that the base rates are such that we can't all be in those percentiles. Now, the question is, how does one overcome these biases? The reason they're important is that they percolate up from individuals to nations. So nations tend to think that they're exceptional and that they deserve the resources that they have. So there's an underestimation of luck in life circumstances and an overestimation of that I made myself the way I am. And this is very, very important. Now the question, psychologists have looked at this for a long time, how do you overcome these type of biases? Well, they're similar to things like biases about reasoning using small and unrepresentative samples. The way you overcome them is you have to teach people about them. You have to teach people that you're really prone to this. You're likely to think that, as we were here last time back in October before the election, that since everyone in the room, as far as we could tell, was not going to vote for Trump, therefore Trump was going to lose. And this is just a very common type of reasoning bias. But I think it relates importantly to a whole variety of cognitive mistakes people can make that lead them to be have greater admiration for their own successes, think that they deserve them, and think that people who are not well off, either in their own nation state or in other nation states, are just not putting in the effort. And we underestimate social structures. So again, these are kind of things that cognitive vices, you might say, that need to be taught. And you need to teach them by teaching about the biases themselves. We also need to teach, of course, emotional skills like empathy and compassion. But there are problems and downsides to empathy and compassion. So for example, we're all well aware of the fact that empathy, that seeing pictures of needy children or people will drive immediate action. But that isn't always sort of towards the best action. So for example, if you show, most Americans believe that people should stay in order for organ transplants. Like if you're number 10 on the list, you should stay at number 10. But if I show you a picture of the person who's number 10, you immediately want them to be moved up to number 2 or 1. Okay? So these are sort of biases that are introduced by some of our emotional equipment. We also need to acknowledge the complexity. This came up in the very first discussion of the issues of around migration and refugees. We talked initially about the balancing between a liberal idea that everybody should be free to move wherever they want to, and communitarian ideas that communities are made by the identity constitutive languages, meanings, morals, and so on that they have. Finally, we need to teach that there are a variety of ways of framing. So we've talked already about the importance of the, and when I'm talking about teaching this, I'm talking about teaching young children this. I'm not talking about teaching college students or each other. I'm talking about really all this stuff. Kids are very, very open to learning about things. So teaching the distinction that we've been talking about between difference between migrants and refugees is important. Also emphasizing the difficulty and the importance of getting the correct description of what's going on. So Jeffrey opened up the conversation yesterday by talking about what I'll now describe as a continuum. So the question is, what's the correct description of what's happening when there's refugees or migrants? One set of descriptions focuses on proximate causes. That's very, very common, and there's a tendency for humans to do that, namely to say, Hurricane Mitch hit, that's why there's this problem. Or the rains didn't come, that's why there's this famine. There's a different type of description, and these might all be compatible, structural descriptions. Well, the reason Hurricane Mitch was so terrible, or the reason that the earthquake in Haiti caused so many problems, is that there's no trees in Haiti in the first place. And why is that the case? Well, it has to do with institutions, the history of the country, and so on. Finally, way out there, there's discussions of why these things happen in terms of historical causes. They could be very, very ancient historical causes. We might say, once upon a time, the Navy, the ships left the United Kingdom, they left Holland, they left Portugal, imperialism and colonialism occurred, goods were extracted, and that's why these countries are very, very vulnerable now to refugees and so on. And these are, again, things I think that young people can learn quickly, that there are all these different ways to think about things. The next point, related, and I'm closing up soon, is to talk about point of view. I thought it was very helpful. Several discussants yesterday talked about, at least I as an American am always put in the situation of having to think of Mexicans coming into my country or Syrian refugees coming in. So I am having to decide as a sort of client whether I will allow these people in. Not me individually, of course, but this is the position of my nation state. I thought what Father Sersky said yesterday about the Pope's suggestion that we pay attention to the point of view of the migrants, and this goes back to the discussion of home, the loss of home, the awful degradation of losing one's home. I think the quote you gave was, pay special attention to the needs of those who are forced to flee their homeland or have none. Okay? And that's a very, very different sort of attitude. It's obviously an attempt at some kind of cognitive empathy or rational compassion, but it has to do with the framing of things. The last point I'll make is this. The question I raised at the beginning was, what are the cognitive and moral traits that we might want to teach to children? And I asked whether there's any kind of consensus among secular ethicists. I've talked so far about cognitive capacities that could be developed. What about the resources for secular moral consensus? Well, just 2 points. I'll just talk about 2 principles. In John Rawls's book, he was a teacher of mine, a good friend of mine. In 1971, John Rawls wrote a book called Theory of Justice, and he said that there are 2 principles that people in liberal democratic societies would choose if they were what he called behind the veil of ignorance in the original position. The first one is we want liberty to live our life as we conceive it. The second one was what he called the difference principle. Namely, we don't want to tolerate social or economic inequality unless some people becoming more advantaged, say economically or in terms of social status, helps those who are least the worst off people. And Rawls later on came to say that he was articulating principles that he thought that people in advanced democracies like Sweden and the United States already believed. I don't think he was right about that. I work at a university where the basketball coach makes $7 million. That's not a society which is working according to the difference principle. Okay? It's just not an institution that's operating in that way. So if these were our antecedent values, then something either went wrong really quickly or he wasn't right in the first place. There's really this diversity. But what are some principles? Well, a couple of philosophers, Peter Singer and then Thomas Poga, who was a student of Rawls also, have tried to develop some principles. Vittorio talks nicely about both these, the first one in his paper. So here's a principle that Singer develops with the following sort of simple thought experiment. If I'm walking along the road and there's a child drowning, it would be really weird and morally bizarre if I were to think about the fact that I have on my nice shoes today and I will get my shoes muddy by going in the water to save that child who's drowning, right? There's something just morally bizarre and horrendous about that. And Singer develops this into this following principle. You're obligated to assist, so this will apply to refugees or migrants, when it is within your power to assist needy others without sacrificing anything of comparable value. Now, pretty straightforwardly, if we think that money, having a lot of money, like I even have as a college professor, has only, its marginal utility goes way down the more I get. I just don't need, Scott and I were talking about this yesterday, like we don't need any more. Well, if that's the case, then I should be able to give up a lot of my money for people who are very, very needy without my suffering in any way myself. And this amps up to possibly the responsibilities of nation-state actors, not just individuals. Another principle that comes from Thomas Poga, and this is my ending, goes this way. So Poga actually uses a principle, development of Rawls's principle, the difference principle this way. One is differentially responsible for bad outcomes the more one participated in causing them in the first place. So here's the idea. We know that lots of refugee and migration problems are caused by poverty, by environmental degradation, and by war. Just speaking for my country, we are both proximate and distal causes of lots of those problems. So if one assigns responsibility to nation states based on the contribution to the conditions of other countries, I heard the Cardinal talk very eloquently about the role of American corporations in the degradation of Nigeria in oil fields. So we think this, if we think this in terms of the law, we ought to think this also in terms of morality. And I think these kind of principles can be taught to children. You're not brainwashing them into you're not just brainwashing them, you're actually influencing them and trying to socialize them to think coherently and consistently with high values, with excellences about these kinds of problems. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof.